Been down to Madison to see the folks and sights. You'd laugh, I'm sure, to hear them talk about the women's rights. Now it's just as plain as my old hat, as plain can be, that if the women want the vote, they'll get no help from me. Not from Joe, not from Joe, if he knows it, not from Joseph, no, 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 not from Joe,
It's
not
1
from me,
o'clock,
I tell
and
you.
welcome
No.
everyone. Thank you for joining us this week for our virtual visit. My name is Lisa Oakley, and I'm the Curator of Education at the East Tennessee Historical Society. And again, we welcome you. Today, the Zoom through East Tennessee will be hosted at our place at the Museum of East Tennessee History at the History Center, hosted by Hannah Rexrode. And Hannah and I work very closely together. She is our education and volunteer program manager and does an incredible job with that, working with our students and teachers at the museum and in their classrooms. And of course, in the last few months, that's taken on a whole new virtual component, and she's done incredibly well with that. But also for, well, probably the past couple of years, and even in her own interest before that, she's been our resident expert on the topic of suffrage, women's suffrage, and particularly as it relates to Tennessee's history, and was incredibly important to a lot of our planning for what we would be doing in the commemoration year, but also worked very closely with our curatorial staff on our Marching to Victory exhibit, which just recently opened, and we are open here at the History Center, and we're thrilled to welcome guests. We are, as we all know, we're very conscious of the 5 best practices for public spaces, and Hannah can talk more about that and visiting the museum during the tour. But we're really tickled that you're here with us today. And if you're interested in learning more, you can always contact us at our easttnhistory.org website. If you have any questions for Hannah during the program, please use the chat feature and type the questions in, and Stephanie Henry will be leading the question and answer session at the end. But we really appreciate Hannah's hosting us today and kind of taking us on the march through to victory through the exhibit, and sharing with us not only the hard work of what they've done in putting the exhibit together, but the incredible story it tells, especially as it relates locally to Knoxville and then extended out to Tennessee. But Hannah, I'm going to let you take it from there, and thanks so much for being with us today.
Hi, everybody. I'm Hannah Rexrode. I am the Education and Volunteer Programs Manager, like Lisa said, here at the East Tennessee Historical Society. And I'm going to be taking you through our Marching to Victory, East Tennessee's Role in Votes for Women exhibit today. Now, we only have 20 minutes, so I can't get into everything that you'll see when you come to visit it, but I am going to hit on some high points and definitely show you some of what we've cooked up for you. So if you'll come on in with me. So this year is the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And unfortunately, a lot of the plans were derailed, both ours and other organizations, by COVID. So this year, we actually toned down our temporary exhibit a little bit, and it is featured in the streetscape space, which is always set up here at the museum to kind of look like a 1920s East Tennessee city. Now, we also have our temporary exhibit up right now that is black and white, Knoxville in the Jim Crow era. And the 2 exhibits go very well hand in hand, and you'll be able to, I'll comment on that more later. But here in the Marching to Victory exhibit, we started in 1776. That is one of the common places to start kind of the women's rights movement, due to the fact that that year Abigail Adams wrote John Adams, her husband, a letter as he and the other founding fathers were setting up kind of the foundation for our country. And Abigail's letter said, "I long to hear that you've declared an independency. And by the way, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." And she goes on to say that, remember, all men would be tyrants if they could, which is a pretty direct shot there at King George III, but also just reminding John and the other founding fathers that women were left out of most things under the monarchy, and that they are a group of people who Abigail felt should be included in the new country. Now, at that point, in the 1700s and the early 1800s, really the only people that were able to, the only women who were able to keep their own money, sue on their own behalf, and could own property were white women under the guardianship, or I'm sorry, without the guardianship of a man. So before they were married, or after they were widowed. Mainly, most of the time when women would get married, they then kind of forfeited those rights, and everything that was theirs also became their husband's. This is also a time when the custody of the children, in case of a divorce, did go to the husband. Women very often could not own the property, keep their own money, like I mentioned. And so there was, in this time of revolution and change, there was a lot of conversation coming up about women's rights and the fact that men were yet again leading this new country. So we'll head on over right here. So in the 1800s, women continued to this discussion, and they did it by gathering in parlors. Now, obviously, at this point, we are talking about women who were wealthy enough to have their own parlors. But parlor talks and teas became a bit of a subversive way for women to discuss current events, share thoughts and ideas. And this is also a meeting place that was very prevalent in the abolition movement. In fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott up in New York both attended the 1840 International Anti-Slavery Convention in London, but they were actually told that they could not participate due to their gender. They had to sit in the balcony and remain quiet. So a bit angered by that, when they came back to the United States, they led parlor meetings and teas and decided that something needed to be done, not only about the institution of slavery, but also women's rights in the United States. And that is where the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention that most of us know about kind of came to be. Lucretia Mott was a little bit older at that point. She was a Quaker, so she was an ardent abolitionist. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been raised, her father was a lawyer, and so she was very familiar with all of the laws that kept women out of what they called at the time the public sphere. During the Victorian era, the idea of the separate spheres for men and women was very popular. Men dominating the public sphere, business, government, even religion, and women being kept more in the private, the home, taking care of the children, entertaining. Now, this is also a time when slavery was still legal in the United States. And so most of the women pushing for suffrage at this point were white women of means who could afford to not work and were not enslaved. So this is a movement that very much evolved over time as the institution of slavery was abolished. So during the Civil War, you can imagine, there were other things to think about, especially here in Tennessee. The crisis on the home front and across the nation kind of took the front seat during that time. But after the Civil War, after slavery was abolished, the discussion started to focus on universal suffrage, giving men who were African American and some who were formerly enslaved, as well as all women, the right to vote. The suffrage movement took hit a fork in the road at that point. Because Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton did not support the 15th Amendment when it was proposed. The 15th Amendment gave only African American men the right to vote, no women. While other suffragists like Lucy Stone and her husband Henry Blackwell supported the 15th Amendment as it was. So kind of saying that, the suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement will get its time. But right now they were focused on the 15th Amendment. So as the suffrage movement split, we had the National Women's Suffrage Association. That was the one that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton started, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was a bit more inclusive of African Americans and men as members. All right, we'll come along. So in 1890, the two groups did merge and formed the National American Women's Suffrage Association. I know that's a mouthful. So for the rest of this, I'm probably going to call it NASA because that's a little bit easier. So NASA was founded when those two organizations merged in 1890. And NASA really focused on getting the amendment through almost any means necessary: municipal suffrage, school board suffrage, state suffrage. In fact, some of the Western states had already granted women suffrage because not only was it to draw more women to those states so that their population would go up so that they could be brought into the Union, but also that was just people who had moved out there were a bit more progressive, and the Civil War had not reached its hand quite as much into those territories out west. Now, like I mentioned at the Seneca Falls Convention, this was started out as a women's rights movement and moved into the women's suffrage movement. So after abolition, the abolition of slavery, then there started to be a bit more discussion, even after the 15th Amendment, about who should get the vote, whether it should be both black women and white women, or if everyone should get it. So now we always like to think of our historical figures as, we like to put them on pedestals sometimes, but we do have to remember that, like the founding fathers, some of the people who came after them were at times problematic by today's standards. In fact, Susan B. Anthony, although she considered herself friends with Frederick Douglass and worked very closely with him, she did say, I'm paraphrasing here, but that she would rather cut off her right arm than the black man get the vote before the woman. So these are things we have to kind of remember and take into consideration while interpreting the suffrage movement, because for a very long time, the stories of African-American suffragists were kind of taken out of the narrative. And during this time of change in public history, we are putting in the stories so that everything can be a bit more inclusive. Now, that doesn't change history, it just changes the way that we look at it. So we're going to move on to our next one. So it was as early as 1878 that the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was introduced to the United States Senate. And that would have been the 16th Amendment at the time had it passed. But as we know, it becomes the 19th. And just to let you know, the wording did not change at all in the years between 1878 and 1920 when it was ratified. So the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was introduced as is in 1878. And Susan B. Anthony did not, unfortunately, she did not survive to see it pass, nor did Mary Wilson McTeer here of Maryville. Mary Wilson was actually the first woman in Tennessee to graduate from a college with her degree. And she was also the woman who founded the Maryville Equal Suffrage Club in the early 1890s. She passed just a few years later, but this Maryville Club was actually the second club in the entire state. Nashville would become the third, and Memphis had already created a club just a few years before Mary started Maryville. So during this time, NASA is continuing to push for suffrage by kind of what we would refer to now as kind of the ladylike means of going about things. They were lobbying, they were writing letters and having parades. Now then, a parade was distinctly different than a march. A march was seen as a bit more aggressive. So at this point in Tennessee, most suffragists were part of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA, and they would have worn both yellow and white. And yellow had already long been a suffrage color in the United States. It dates back to the 1860s when a campaign in Kansas, the women actually used the state flower of Kansas, the sunflower, as one of their symbols. So that's where yellow comes from. White kind of connotates moral purity and kind of American feminism. And then as we move on, you'll see purple, and that did not, and on my mask as well, but that did not kind of come into play until the early 1900s, and we'll get there. So at this point, all the way up until 1900, the main suffrage colors you're going to see are going to be yellow and white. And we do have newspaper articles that describe the Tennessee Equal Suffrage Association having balls in order to raise money for the women's suffrage movement. And they were decorated with white and yellow flowers and banners and everything. So we're going to move on. All right, so we moved on just a little bit. Now, by the early 1900s, like I mentioned, things had started to change. You're getting a new generation of suffragists coming onto the scene. Susan B. Anthony passed away in the early 1900s, so the leadership is starting to change. Carrie Chapman Catt, who studied under Susan B. Anthony in the movement, becomes a more prominent leader in NASA. But then you also have people like Alice Paul emerging on the scene. And Alice Paul was a Quaker herself, and she had gone over and spent some time in London and spent time with the suffragettes over there. Now you'll notice that I used a different word for the suffrage supporters in England, and that is because here in the United States, suffragette was not necessarily offensive, but a bit of a demeaning term because et in French is the suffix meaning little. So it's a bit kind of like, oh, those little ladies with their suffrage cause. Most people in the United States considered themselves suffragists, whether they were men or women. But in England, the suffragettes were followers of Emmeline Pankhurst, and they very often wore green, white, and purple. And this is where the purple is going to come in. When Alice Paul comes back to the United States after serving some time in prison in London, she starts the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. And she incorporates purple into the colors as a nod to those English suffragettes. So instead of the green, white, and purple, the United States has the yellow, white, and purple. Now, Alice Paul also had some very strong opinions about how things should be done moving forward. She was a bit more militant, not violent like Emmeline Pankhurst and her followers, because Alice Paul was a Quaker, so she was against violence, but she was more militant. She thought larger parades, marches, picketing were going to be the future of the suffrage movement. Now, she, in 1913, organized the suffrage procession in Washington, D.C., which was a huge success. There was a tableau of women dressed as Liberty and kind of doing skits that dealt with women's issues. Also, a number of the parade participants wore different things showing what they did. There were women in the clergy who wore their robes. There were women in academia who wore their graduation and those robes, their academic robes. Excuse me, guys, it's a little hard with a mask on. And that was kind of her first step into becoming more militant. So with the Congressional Union, she actually starts that, and NASA and Paul have a break over her methods. So in 1915, they've tried to come back together, but they officially break in December of 1915. So at that point, you have the Congressional Union, which would eventually become what we know as the Woman's Party, and you have NASA going about things very differently. Paul and her group also thought it best that women's suffrage be obtained through a constitutional amendment, where, like I said earlier, NASA supported gaining suffrage almost on any front. So we are going to step over to one of my favorite people. And this is Lizzie Crozier French. Many of you are probably familiar with her from the Market Square statue that is here in Knoxville. This bust was done by Mary Rudin. And Mary is very hands-on in the suffrage movement and the commemoration of it here in East Tennessee. And I love Lizzie Crozier French because she kind of fell between those two different generations of suffragists. She was born in 1851, and her childhood home was actually right across Gay Street from where we are now. It's where the Farragut Hotel was. But Lizzie is widowed after only 18 months of marriage, and from there on, she is very outspoken. She publishes a manual on elocution or public speaking. She and her sister established the East Tennessee Female Institute, and she also becomes Knoxville's first police matron, as well as participates in the 1916 Race Congress, which is a meeting had between African-American leaders and white community leaders here in Knoxville to discuss race relations in the city and how they can be bettered and changed. And that is something that you can learn more about in our black and white Knoxville in the Jim Crow era exhibit when you come in. Now, the other thing about French that I really like is the fact that she is one of the only women that I've ever read about and researched that was in good standing with both NASA and the National Woman's Party. By the time she is marching actually outside the White House, Lizzie is well into her 60s. And for a woman of that time, 60 today is nothing. But at that time, it would have been considered kind of past her prime, and it would have been considered very unladylike and not great for a woman her age to be participating in events like that. So Lizzie actually switches over to the National Woman's Party and becomes the leader of the Tennessee branch in the late 19-teens. Now, we are going to step on over to everyone's favorite artifact. And I'll give you a bit more background. So I mentioned that Lizzie marched outside the White House, and that is something that the National Woman's Party did starting in 1917 in January. They started pickets outside the White House to convince President Wilson to speak out in favor of women's suffrage. Up until that point, he had not. And they pretty much decided that a scene needed to be caused. They needed to draw more attention to it. Now, only about 3 months after they started those pickets, the women who were in them were called the Silent Sentinels. The United States entered World War I. And at that point, the National Woman's Party very often in the press was painted as seditious and anti-American because they were picketing the White House in a time of war. NASA, on the other hand, jumped on the war effort and promoted kind of, women are participating in the war effort, so why can't they vote? National Women's Party took the approach of, President Wilson, you're saying that we are spreading democracy across the world with this war. What about half of the people here who can't participate in the elective franchise? So after all of this goes on, and obviously we know how World War I ends, President Wilson does come out in 1918 in support of women's suffrage. And not even a year later, it is passed, the 19th Amendment is passed by the United States legislature. Now, passed does not mean ratified. After it's passed by the US Senate and House of Representatives, 3/4 of the states need to vote to ratify it. So they get started. Wisconsin is the first state that votes to ratify the 19th Amendment, followed by a few others shortly thereafter. And by the summer of 1920, 35 states have voted to ratify. Now, Tennessee was not one of those states. In fact, nobody thought Tennessee was going to be able to even vote on ratification, because after Reconstruction, the Tennessee Constitution was amended to include a measure that says that when voting on a federal amendment, there has to be an election between the time the federal legislature passes it and when the state legislature votes on it. But in 1920, the Supreme Court overruled that with a decision pretty much saying that federal rules overrule state rules when it comes to the passing of federal amendments. So in the summer of 1920, Tennessee could now potentially vote on the women's suffrage amendment, and people descend on Nashville. Governor Roberts calls a special session of the legislature so that they can vote on it at the urging of President Wilson. And the anti-suffragists, the suffragists, the National Women's Party, NASA, as well as all of the men who were in the legislature come to Nashville. Many of them are staying at the Hermitage Hotel, and it becomes a free-for-all of lobbying at that point. Now, the suffragists had been keeping tallies of who they thought would vote yes or no on ratification. And as soon as the votes started in the Senate, it passed through the Senate pretty quickly. The Senate voted to ratify, but the House of Representatives was held up. Speaker Seth Walker had been a pro-suffragist, switched to anti, throwing everybody off, and then he called on August 18th a vote to table the amendment, which effectively would have killed it or delayed it long enough so that Tennessee didn't have to deal with it. Now they're going through and they're voting, and they get to the end of the vote, and it looks like the amendment is going to be tabled. And Banks Turner of Gibson County pretty shyly states that he does not want it to be tabled, essentially clearing the path so that the amendment can be voted on. So now at that point, Turner has changed his vote. So the suffragists and antis tally him as a pro-suffragist. So now it's looking like that with his vote changed over, it could be a tie. The vote for ratification could be a tie. But there's one more surprise to be had. Harry Byrne, 24 years old, from Nyota, he actually is in the House of Representatives wearing his red rose, which means he is an anti-suffragist. And when they get to the B's in the roll call, he very meekly votes A in favor of ratification. Now, so many people were expecting him to vote against it that there was some confusion. People thought maybe he had misspoken since he was one of the junior representatives at that point, or that he just was wrong. His mentor, Herschel Candler, was a very, very outspoken anti-suffragist who made some inflammatory remarks that day that could be considered today, and even back then, misogynist and racist. And Harry did not agree with those comments. He was actually in favor of women's suffrage, but was conflicted because he thought his constituents would want him to vote against the ratification. But luckily, Harry had a letter in his pocket from his mother, Feb. And Feb Byrne was a college-educated woman. She was in her 40s at the time that she wrote this letter, which we have on display here in the Marching to Victory exhibit. And in this letter, which you can see is pretty long, Feb not only discusses suffrage, but she talks about what's going on in Nyota and when she'll see Harry next. But she fits in a few things in there like hurrah and vote for suffrage. But also she says, be a good boy and help Miss Thomas Catt with her rats. And that is in reference to Carrie Chapman Catt, the leader of NASA, and rats being the ratification. Later in a newspaper article, Feb says that maybe she shouldn't have used slang, but that she and Harry were pals and he would know what his mother was trying to say. She also said that if she hadn't known that Harry was in favor of suffrage, she wouldn't have urged him to vote that way. So Feb, I love this story because it is a clear story of a woman who was not allowed to directly participate in the elective franchise, influencing the outcome of a vote. And Feb, for as many of you know, is very widely, she's well regarded, not only here in Tennessee, but nationwide. And the story of Harry is known, but very often Feb gets left out. And I think we are definitely trying to fix that here at the museum. Now we are gonna head on over to one more panel that we have. And so it became very apparent that the Tennessee was going to be either make or break the suffrage movement for the most part. So when it passed, with Harry breaking what would have been a tie otherwise, even with Turner's vote in favor of it, the place erupted. Harry actually kind of hid out and laid low for a little while before coming down and telling newspapers that he did what every good boy should. He listened to his mother. And he actually thought that that would end his political career. We know that it didn't. He actually went on to serve much longer as a public servant. But in this exhibit, we want to put some focus on the fact that even though Tennessee was the last kind of battlefield for the 19th Amendment, the fight did not end there for women's suffrage and civil rights. In 1920, women got the right to vote legally, but with Jim Crow laws and literacy tests and poll taxes, it would not be until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act that African American women and men could go to the polls unobstructed. And voter suppression was very widespread at that point. And so when you come here to the Museum of East Tennessee History to see our Marching to Victory exhibit, please also then follow up with our black and white Knoxville in the Jim Crow era exhibit to get a kind of more well-rounded view of what was going on in the country at that point. So I'm going to stop now because I could go on for days, but you don't want to hear me go on that long. And we are going to take some questions.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. We do have quite a few questions, actually, some that you've somewhat covered. So we'll just start at the beginning. Who is your favorite suffragist and why?
Ooh, that one's tough. So there's a few. I do love Lizzie Crozier French because she showed that she was willing to kind of change the way she did things and evolve. But I am also a huge Alice Paul fan because she did come into the game and acknowledge the work that had come before her, but also realized that that wasn't going to work moving forward. And very often people say, well, which strategies worked better, the National Woman's Party or NASA? And I think that really the 19th Amendment would not have been passed without the efforts of both.
Okay. What do you find to be the most important local suffrage story?
Ooh, let's head on over to that one. So in 1917, the National Woman's Party, a few of them embarked on what they called the Dixie Tour, touring the southern states. And the southern states were some of the last ones to hop on board with the suffrage movement, if they even did at all. And that is due to what at the time would have been referred to as the race problem. Notice my air quotes. White people in the South were afraid that if universal suffrage became the norm, that Black women and men would essentially outnumber white votes. And so the Dixie Tour was part of an effort to bring those southern states on board. And in 1917, Joy Young, Maud Younger, and Catherine Clemens Gold, all well-known members of the National Woman's Party, were traveling through Tennessee. And when they came to Knoxville, Lizzie Crozier French had been trying to get them a spot in Market Hall, but that was shut down by the city commission. Then she finally secured them a place to speak in the county courthouse. But when they arrived there on a very rainy, chilly November night, they found some of the sheriff and his deputies guarding the courthouse, refusing them entrance. Now, they did not give up then. In fact, the Central Labor Union sent over 80 armed men to escort the women into the courthouse. And when they arrived, the sheriff and his deputies retreated into the building. The Central Labor Union men surrounded it, and the women gave their speeches in the rain from the steps of the county courthouse. So I love that story because it is showing that the women were not afraid to persevere. In fact, at least one of these women, Joy, I believe, had spent time in Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia for being arrested during one of the National Woman's Party pickets. So this is one of my favorite local stories.
Okay. We have a couple more. In your opinion, what were the biggest barriers in the fight for women's suffrage?
I think really the biggest barriers, they changed over time, but some of them were just disruption of what people saw as the norm. That idea of women entering the public sphere, I think, scared people. People thought the American nuclear family, even though it wasn't called that yet, was going to fall apart, and that the men would have to stay home and do the laundry and take care of the children while the women were out at the polls and at their jobs. Well, knowing what we know now today, that obviously did not happen. Also, there was, especially in the South, like I mentioned, the barrier was the idea of giving Black men and women the right to vote. And in fact, Josephine Pearson, an anti-suffragist from Monteagle, Tennessee, even said that women's suffrage would turn the South over to Negro domination. And that is the same kind of rhetoric that Candler, Harry Burns' mentor, used in his speeches. So there were two very big fears that acted as barriers.
Okay. One question that was submitted: have we come as far as we need to go to secure universal suffrage? What more can be done?
I think there is still work to be done. That is a debate that is happening right now, and I urge you to turn on the news and learn about it as much as you can, because there are still issues with voting in the present day, and voter suppression and things like that. So I urge you guys to go ahead and learn more and get out and express your beliefs, just as the suffragists did 100 years ago.
Okay, and lastly, what do guests need to know before visiting the East Tennessee History Center? What are the current restrictions?
That's a great question. So as you can see, we are wearing masks when we cannot socially distance. Rebecca, who's holding the camera, is less than 6 feet away from me, so we both have our masks on. We also have hand sanitizer stations set up around the museum. We also have some contactless forms of payment, so we are encouraging you to use credit cards and debit cards when possible, but obviously we understand that not everyone can at all times. We've also cut down our capacity in the museum to about 50 people, and our auditorium is not currently open for rental. But we have had some very small groups coming in, but if you want to bring a group in, please reach out first, because you will need to have a reservation. And we are cleaning the museum and disinfecting it sometimes twice a day.
All right, well, thank you to everyone who joined us today for our virtual tour of the Marching to Victory exhibit. A big thank you to Hannah Rexrode and Rebecca Steimer for a great program. As Lisa Oakley mentioned earlier, our next visit will take place next Thursday, September the 3rd, with the folks at Blunt Mansion, where we'll learn about the Craighead Jackson House. You can see our recent and upcoming social media posts and our next e-invite for further details on this event. Again, thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great day.
You're just right, how blind I've been. I ne'er had seen it thus. 'Tis true that taxes you must pay without a word or fuss. You are subject to the laws men made, and yet no word or note can you sing out where it will count. I'll help you win the vote. Yes, I will.
Thank you, Joe.
We'll together soon be voters. Yes, we will. If you'll all vote yes at the polls next